So we are now in a position of being enslaved to sin and enslaved not only to the moral corruption that the fall entails, but to the epistemic corruption. And so we have put ourselves in this position. We have blinded ourselves, or at least made ourselves severely myopic. We have made it very difficult for us to have the kind of knowledge that we used to have, and so very difficult to live the kind of life we used to be capable of living. Now, in this video, I want to talk about a dimension of this problem that I think is absolutely fundamental and underlies the various other aspects of the degradation that I've been talking about. Calvin is, broadly speaking, in the Platonic philosophical tradition. He sees himself as, in many ways, a follower of Augustine, but he does think that Augustine is too optimistic about our nature. Now, Augustine is not particularly optimistic about our nature, and so you might think, wow, worse than Augustine, that's pretty bad. But here's the general idea. He really thinks that the solution that Augustine comes up with to the fundamental problem of Platonism doesn't really work. Here's why. Plato, remember, postulated the forms. He said it was possible for us to know things objectively about the world, to be able to communicate with one another, to be able to resist relativism, skepticism, other challenges to our ability to have objective knowledge by saying that there are certain abstract forms that we have epistemic access to. So there is such a thing as the form of the good, the form of justice, the form of virtue, the form of courage. Those things exist independently of us, independently of any of our finite minds. And so we can make judgments that are accurate or inaccurate about all of those things. It's not just a question of, well, that's good for you, but bad for me. No, there is such a thing as what is good, full stop. There is a question of what is just, objectively speaking. And that's something we can be right or wrong about. Now, Plato is vague about how it is possible for us to know these forms. How do we know what justice truly is, what virtue is, and so on? Augustine's answer is God illumines our minds. These ideas, these forms of justice, of the good, and so on, are ideas in the mind of God. And God enables our minds to have access to those by illumining our minds. Now, of course, this is not a complete illumination. It's not as if we thereby gain the knowledge of God and the ability mentally of God. But there are aspects of the divine mind that we are able to share through that process of illumination. So how do I know what justice is, what the good is, what virtue is? Answer is, God enables me to have that knowledge. Like my knowledge of mathematics, that kind of abstract knowledge is a universal knowledge, an objective knowledge, one that establishes objective normative standards of right and wrong, correct and incorrect. And all of that is made possible through God's causal activity. I am not capable of reaching the forms on my own. The forms are causally inert. They don't themselves have causal power, as Plato seemed to think. But God can do anything. God has the required causal power, and God resolves this problem for us. Well, that was, for a millennium really, a highly stable solution. But Calvin worries about it. He sees the fall as having made it impossible for us to rely on that Augustinian resolution of Platonism's problem. Why? Well, if our cognitive faculties are damaged, if in effect our minds are no longer illumined the way they were before the fall, then we are viewing things through a glass darkly. So we are no longer in a position to have the kind of access to the form of the good, the form of justice, the form of virtue that God's illumination made possible. We were able to have that kind of knowledge before the fall, but now the mirror inside the mind is broken. Now these things have all been obscured. We are viewing things through actually a broken glass darkly. And so how do we do it? Well, we need a different method. So I think Calvin views Augustine's solution as an outstanding solution for a prelapsarian condition. That's what it was like before the fall of mankind. But now that our faculties are corrupted and degraded, and that we have in effect damaged them in such a way that God's illumination no longer does the kind of work that it did before the fall, we can't rest content with that kind of Augustinian solution. So if you want to think of it this way, Calvin remains an Augustinian in his account of how philosophical questions ought to be answered before the fall. Augustine's basically got it right before the fall. But after the fall, our brains, our minds, our mental capacities, our faculties have been damaged in such a way that they are corrupted, degraded. It is no longer possible for us to benefit from God's illumination in the way that we used to. Our minds have been darkened. We ourselves have pulled down the blinds and prevented ourselves from benefiting from the illumination activity of God. So now what can we do? Remember that in the Republic, Plato talks about being able to see the forms and mathematical objects, things of that nature that are not sensible objects in the world, with the eye of the mind. He says the eyes and other faculties of the senses enable us to relate to the sensible, the visible world, but the intelligible world, the world of the forms, that's something we can see only with the eye of the mind. But that's exactly where the problem lies, Calvin thinks. He says, our minds are so blinded that they cannot perceive the truth, and all our senses are so corrupt that we wickedly rob God of his glory. So we are no longer capable of benefiting from illumination the way we once did. Accordingly, Augustine, in speaking of this inability of human reason to understand the things of God, says that he deems the grace of illumination not less necessary to the mind than the light of the sun to the eye. Augustine here is really tracking Plato's account in the Republic and directly following Plato in saying the eye of the mind has to operate just as the eye of the body does. The eye of the body is able to do what it does because of the illumination of the sun. The eye of the mind does what it does by virtue of the illumination of God. If we have obscured that, if we have now blinded ourselves, we're in trouble because that illumination no longer helps us. He says we open our eyes to behold the light, whereas the mental eye remains shut until it's opened by the Lord. I feel pleased with the well-known saying, which has been borrowed from the writings of Augustine, that man's natural gifts were corrupted by sin, and his supernatural gifts withdrawn, meaning by supernatural gifts the light of faith and righteousness, which would have been sufficient for the attainment of heavenly life and everlasting felicity. So there really is a sense in which we have been blinded, another sense in which our faculties have been damaged, but are no longer completely gone. Our ability to discern the supernatural is now gone. That's been withdrawn. We've lost that completely. Our ability to know something about the natural world, however, that has simply been damaged. So we have to do that in a different way, but the faculties are not gone. There is still something we see in the broken glass of the mind, but it is not what we were able to see before. However, when it comes to the things of God, we used to see God face to face. Now we can't see God at all. And so that's a problem. How is it that we're capable of knowing God? How is it that we're capable of knowing ourselves? Or what we should do? It's a serious problem. And Calvin here is reintroducing the possibility of skepticism. He is admitting that the skeptical worries are serious worries. We cannot simply say God solved the problem. Before the fall, that was fair enough. God did solve the problem. After the fall, that is no longer available to us. God solved the problem and we threw the solution away. So now we face those skeptical worries again. His analogy for this is exile. Man, when he withdrew his allegiance to God, was deprived of the spiritual gifts by which he had been raised to the hope of eternal salvation. Hence it follows that he is now an exile from the kingdom of God, so that all things which pertain to the blessed life of the soul are extinguished in him until he recover them by the grace of regeneration. So here's a way of thinking about Calvin's general approach to not only epistemology, but really to philosophical questions in general. We need a philosophy before the fall, a prelapsarian philosophy, and also a philosophy for after the fall, a postlapsarian philosophy. What kind of philosophy does he adopt before the fall? A version of rationalism, a version of Platonism filtered through Augustine. The Augustinian version of Platonism here, he thinks works just fine. God has illumined our minds, enabling us to have access to the forms, enabling us to understand what the truth is, what justice is, what virtue is, what the good is, enabling us to see God and understand something at least of the nature of God. After the fall, it's a totally different story. That kind of rationalist picture is no longer available to us. Certainly not in a strong form that we have direct access to the abstract objects, the forms, and anything else that would give us knowledge of objective truth about justice, the good, about human nature itself, about especially the nature of God. That's gone. So we're in the position at best of a kind of moderate rationalism. Maybe there are a few innate truths left, a few things we could know that are synthetic a priori, but for the most part, we have to rely on our senses for an understanding of the world. We face skeptical worries with respect to abstractions, and especially things like truth, like justice, the good, virtue, and so forth. And an extreme form of that when we begin to think about supernatural things in the nature of God. So philosophy before the fall, we can be strong rationalists. We can be foundationalists who see a rock-solid foundation for knowledge. We can be metaphysical realists. We have access to a world that is objective and exists independently of us. We can be moral realists. There really is a moral fact of the matter established and known by virtue of God's illumination of our minds. We can adopt a divine command theory. God approves of certain things. They are right simply because God approves of them, and we can look to God for approval to find out what's right and what's wrong. So it is an epistemological approach as well as a more theoretical, moral, realist approach to what makes right actions right. We have freedom of the will before the fall. We have a capacity for virtue. We have a strength of character that enables us to resist weakness of will. We have a knowledge of the good. We have a knowledge of ourselves and of God before the fall. After the fall, it's very different. Our account of knowledge has to be, at best, a very limited, moderate rationalism. Maybe simply empiricism. Maybe we're left in skepticism. That's something left to be determined. What about the nature of ethics? We no longer have access to what the good is, what justice is, to what God approves and disapproves. At best, we're now trapped in a world of appearances. We don't have access to those underlying realities. Maybe they're there, but we now have no contact with them. We have no way of establishing that they're there. So, in short, metaphysical realism to us now seems like a rather extravagant hypothesis. Maybe it's true, but maybe we should be anti-realist. The world we live in appears to be a world of appearances that is thoroughly mind-dependent, dependent on our own mental activity, our own mental constructions. It looks as if to the extent that we know anything about ethics at all, well, we have to be intuitionists. We have seemings, we have rough moral feelings about what seems right and wrong to us. Is that accurate? Is that reflecting something that is really in the objects themselves, in the moral facts themselves, if there are any moral facts? Or is this a question of our own reactions imposing some kind of moral structure on the world? We can no longer be sure. We can't tell whether what we're responding to is really in the world or really a question simply of our own responses. Do we have anything like rock-solid knowledge? No, we have no certainty. We are at best fallibilists, maybe skeptics outright, but at least knowledge seems fallible. We can't trust that anything could be known with certainty. We're not sure that anything can be known at all. Before the fall, we had freedom of the will, but we have now sold ourselves into slavery. So actually, we have to be determinists. We no longer have freedom of the will. At best, we can talk about compatibilism. We're determined, but there are aspects in which we can't know that. And so what we call freedom is really just an unknown determination. And finally, we're thoroughly captive to weakness of will. We no longer have even a capacity for virtue on our own. We are totally depraved. We are no longer capable of living a good life on our own. At most, we can be helped by God, and that's a different part of the story. So prelapsarian picture is Platonic. It is Augustinian. We have some certain knowledge of our own existence, for example, even of the existence of God. We have knowledge of how to live. We are capable of objective knowledge, of truth, of justice, of the nature of the good, of virtue. We are capable of making our own free choices. After the fall, none of those things are possible. We are trapped in a world of appearances. We can't be sure there is any underlying objective reality. We certainly can't have knowledge of it. We have nothing like certain knowledge or objective knowledge. At best, we are constructing pictures of the world and wondering to what extent they depend on the nature of the world and to what extent they are as a result of our own creative activity. We at best have moral responses to the world, but we don't know whether they're responses to anything objective or whether they are our own constructions and creations. And finally, we have no freedom. What we call freedom is really simply a form of ignorance. So pre-lapsarian philosophy and post-lapsarian philosophy are radically different. Before the fall, Plato, Augustine, Descartes, these are our heroes. After the fall, Sextus Empiricus, Hume, those are our heroes. That's a very different story, and a radical difference that has huge ramifications for every area of philosophy and for the nature of theology itself.